The stale air in my small apartment tasted like ash and regret. Every breath was a reminder, a phantom tickle in my throat that mimicked the smoke from that night. 6 months. 6 months since the embers cooled, since the sirens faded, since the silence truly began. I traced the condensation on the window pane with a numb finger, the city outside a blur of indifferent lights. My design, my flawless, award-winning design. It had stood so proud, so modern, until the fire found its weakest point, until it took them. My days had become a monotonous cycle of coffee, staring, and the crushing weight of what I'd lost. The blueprints were still stacked in the corner, gathering dust, mocking me with their precise lines and elegant curves. I hadn't touched a drafting pencil since. The architect was gone, replaced by a ghost haunting his own life. Then the letter arrived. Thick, cream-colored stationery, an embossed seal I didn't recognize. It lay on the chipped laminate of my kitchen counter for 2 days before I found the will to open it. My name, Typerton, felt alien. The contents were even more so. An ancestral home. A sprawling, forgotten estate nestled deep in the countryside, bequeathed to me, the last living relative by a distant gray tant I'd never known. My gray tant, the letter explained, had passed quietly alone just weeks prior. The lawyer's firm, a venerable institution in a town I'd never heard of, urged my immediate attention. A fresh start, the lawyer, a dry, reedy voice on the phone, had called it. I heard a flicker of something deep within me, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark. Not hope, not yet. Perhaps just a desperate urge to escape the suffocating familiarity of my own despair. The lawyer, a meticulous man named Mr. Finch, explained the property was vast, isolated, and in need of considerable work. A project, Mr. Raj, he'd said, his voice crackling slightly. Perhaps exactly what you need. He hadn't known about the fire, about my profession. I hadn't enlightened him. There was a caveat, a peculiar condition attached to the inheritance. A sealed box containing an item of sentimental value to my great aunt was not at the estate. It was, according to her specific instructions, held in a secure, if unconventional, location. I had to retrieve it myself before the final transfer of deeds. It's an old place, Mr. Finch had coughed, somewhat disused now, but secure nonetheless. He gave me directions, an address far out past the city limits, deep into a forgotten industrial zone. The location, he'd stressed, was non-negotiable. I wrote it down on a napkin, the grease from a long-forgotten takeout meal smudging the ink. The abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The words felt cold, sharp, like shards of ice in my stomach. What could my great aunt possibly have stored there? The thought alone prickled my skin. Despite the unease, the strange pull of the unknown was stronger than the inertia of my grief. I needed to move. I needed to breathe air that didn't taste like ghosts. I packed a single duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, a worn copy of a forgotten novel. My car, a silent companion, hummed to life with a familiar grumble. The drive was long, the landscape slowly morphing from concrete sprawl to faded billboards, then to endless stretches of skeletal trees. The sky pressed down, a bruised purple-gray. I followed the lawyer's precise, almost obsessive directions. My GPS struggled, losing signal in the more remote areas. The road narrowed, asphalt cracking, eventually giving way to gravel that crunched beneath my tires. Finally, I saw it. A hulking, brutalist structure of cracked concrete and rusting rebar, squatting low against the horizon. No windows seemed intact. The main gate, a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, hung askew, its padlock long broken. A sign, faded to illegibility, leaned precariously beside it. This was the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The air here was different, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid like old blood. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. The building loomed, a monument to forgotten pain. The entrance, a gaping maw, was a concrete tunnel leading into absolute blackness. I pulled out the heavy-duty flashlight Mr. Finch had insisted I bring. Its beam cut a pale swath through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light like trapped spirits. The interior was a labyrinth of echoing corridors. My footsteps, usually quiet, now boomed with unsettling resonance. The walls were scarred, graffiti scrawled over what looked like old scorch marks. Names, dates, angry declarations. I walked past empty guard stations, their windows shattered, past heavy steel doors hanging ajar, revealing cells choked with debris. The temperature dropped with every step I took deeper into the complex. The silence was not empty. It was a presence, watching. I found the designated locker, number 137, exactly as Mr. Finch had described. It was tucked away in a dimly lit section of what must have been a records room, a small, unassuming metal box amongst dozens of others, all sealed shut with thick layers of rust. The key Mr. Finch had given me, an ornate brass thing, slid into the lock with a soft click. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a single, small wooden box, wrapped in brittle, yellowed paper. Inside, nestled on a bed of ancient, faded velvet, was a single, tarnished silver locket and a tightly folded handwritten note. I finally forced it open. Inside, 2 miniature photographs, faded almost to sepia, stared back at me. One was of a stern-faced woman, undoubtedly my great aunt. The other was a man with eyes that seemed to pierce through the aged paper, eyes that held a familiar, unsettling intensity. He looked like me, too much like me. The note, written in a spidery, elegant script, simply read, "The weight of inheritance is not in stone and timber, Raj. It is in blood, and in what we choose to remember." I stood there, the locket heavy in my hand, the note rustling softly in the unmoving air. What had my great-aunt been trying to tell me? And who was the man in the locket? Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel, the locket still clutched in my other hand. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, a cruel parody of the flames that had consumed my life. The directions to the ancestral home were now loaded into my struggling GPS. The journey felt less like a fresh start and more like an unavoidable descent. The house appeared out of the twilight, a silhouette against the dying light. It was enormous, a looming shadow of gables and turrets, partially obscured by overgrown trees. The air around it felt heavy, stagnant, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. This wasn't just an old house. This was a place that had been waiting for me. What secrets did this colossal structure hold, and what did my great-aunt's cryptic message truly mean? The metallic tang of rust and stale air clung to my tongue in the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. My fingers, numb with more than just the biting cold, still gripped the locket. The note, a brittle rectangle of aged paper, felt alive in my other hand, whispering secrets the silence refused to share. The house remembers. What had she known? What had she seen within those ancestral walls that had driven her to this place, to leave me this fragmented warning? I had come here, to this forgotten corner of the old district, seeking answers about her final days, a desperate attempt to piece together the fragments of a past I barely remembered. The cell block, a skeletal remains of brick and rebar, offered no further solace. Its empty cells stared back like vacant eyes, each a repository of forgotten suffering. I couldn't stay. The air pressed in, thick and suffocating, pushing me towards an unknown destiny. The drive to the ancestral home was a blur of gray highway and insistent rain. The locket, tucked into my shirt, felt like a hot coal against my sternum. Every turn of the wheel, every mile eaten by the road, pulled me closer to the source of my great-aunt's cryptic message. Guilt, a constant companion since the fire, sat beside me in the passenger seat, a silent, hulking passenger. It reminded me of the blueprints, of the design flaws, of the smoke and the screams I could never quite erase. When the car finally crunched onto the gravel path, the house loomed, a silhouette against the bruised sky. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a skeletal behemoth of weathered stone and decaying timber. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snaked across its facade, clutching the crumbling masonry like grasping fingers. A few panes were shattered, jagged teeth in a gaping maw. The front porch sagged, its railing splintered, the paint flaking like diseased skin. This wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof and the distant sigh of wind through skeletal trees. I sat there for a long moment, my hands tight on the steering wheel, just looking at it. This was where my family had come from. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through me. Stepping out, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with forgotten potpourri. It prickled the back of my throat. Dust motes danced in the sparse slivers of light filtering through grimy windows, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten things. I walked through the main hall, past draped furniture that looked like shrouded corpses, into what must have been the living room. The fireplace, a gaping maw of blackened stone, dominated one wall. Something about the texture, a subtle grit, like fine ash, made my skin crawl. My initial task was simply to open some windows, air the place out. I found a window in the study, its latch rusted shut. With a grunt and a twist, it finally gave, sending a shower of dried paint flakes to the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to clear the lingering scent from my nostrils. The metallic sweetness seemed to cling stubbornly. Later, as twilight bled into the vast rooms, I began to unpack a few essentials in what I decided would be my bedroom. It was on the second floor, overlooking the overgrown gardens. As I folded a shirt and placed it in a dusty dresser drawer, I noticed it, a faint impression on the wooden surface, like something heavy had been sitting there for a very long time. I traced the outline with my finger. It was roughly circular, about the size of a teacup base. But there was no teacup, no saucer, just the impression. I shrugged it off. Old houses had old marks. A sudden draft ghosted past my cheek, raising gooseflesh on my arms. The window was still closed. I looked at the heavy velvet curtains hanging motionless. No, that couldn't be right. I checked the window again, pressing my palm against the glass. It was sealed tight, my breath hitched. Then from somewhere deep within the house I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the settling of old timber. It was too deliberate, too steady. It sounded like something being dragged, or perhaps a slow, heavy heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. My chest tightened. Where was that sound coming from? The note, a brittle rectangle of aged paper, felt alive in my other hand, whispering secrets the silence couldn't entirely smother. I unfolded it again, the creases groaning softly. He feeds on what I carry. My mind, ever the architect, tried to construct a rational explanation. An old prank, a morbid joke left by a former occupant, perhaps one of the guards or even a prisoner from before the riot. But the locket, it was undeniably mine, or rather my family's. A piece of my past found here in this forgotten corner of the house. That connection, however tenuous, gnawed at the edges of my composure. I ran a thumb over the locket's cool metal, its surface etched with swirling, almost organic patterns that I'd never noticed before. The note, now folded and tucked into my pocket, felt like a burning coal against my thigh. I needed to leave this place, this suffocating tomb of concrete and despair. The air here was too thick, too heavy with phantom echoes. As I turned to retrace my steps, a low, guttural groan vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. It wasn't the creak of settling timbers or the groan of old pipes. This was deeper, more resonant, like the very foundation of the building was sighing in agony. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, the beam of my flashlight trembling. I swept the light across the rows of empty cells, the open doors like gaping mouths. Nothing. Then a faint scratching began, not from the walls, not from the ceiling, but from within one of the cells. Cell Block A, Cell 7. I knew it was 7 because my flashlight beam had just swept over the faded number painted above the door. A persistent, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging across rough stone or something trying to claw its way out. My heart began to beat a frantic drum against my ribs. It was too regular, too intentional to be a rat, too distinct to be my imagination. My hand, clammy with sweat, instinctively reached for the locket in my pocket. As my fingers closed around it, the scratching intensified, becoming frantic, urgent. It was right there, just beyond the rusted bars. A faint, foul odor, like damp earth and something sickly sweet, began to permeate the already stale air. My breath hitched. I could feel a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of unseen eyes fixed on me. This wasn't just a draft. This wasn't just an old building. This was something else. My mind, usually so sharp, so analytical, struggled to process. Old buildings have noises, but this was different. This was focused. I forced myself to move closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The scratching reached a fever pitch, sounding like a desperate struggle. I peered through the bars into cell 7. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No pile of debris, no broken furniture, no sign of anything that could make such a sound. Yet the scratching continued, echoing from the very air inside the cell, an invisible presence clawing at unseen walls. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into absolute blackness. Panic seized me. A guttural cry escaped my lips. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, humming vibration that seemed to emanate from the floor, through my boots, up my legs, into my very bones. It felt like a resonance, a frequency that was trying to shake me apart from the inside. My phone screen flared to life, a weak, desperate beacon. The light, though dim, was enough to reveal something new. Etched into the concrete floor of cell 7, where moments before there had been nothing but dust and grime, was a symbol, crude, almost childish, but undeniably there. And beneath it, a single word: architect. My own profession, my own burden. The locket in my pocket felt searing hot. I pulled it out, my fingers burning. The intricate patterns on its surface were now glowing faintly, a soft, phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with the humming vibration. The spirals on the locket's surface mirrored the symbol on the cell floor exactly. 2 interlocking spirals. My breath came in ragged gasps. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. This was something real, something that knew me, that knew my past, my profession, my guilt. It was reacting to me, to the locket, to the very essence of my presence. The note's words echoed in my head. He feeds on what you carry. He knows your burden. My family. The fire. The house I designed. It all crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. This place wasn't just inherited, it was waiting for me. The humming intensified, vibrating through the abandoned cell block closed since the riot of '87. I could feel the individual concrete blocks in the walls thrumming, a low, resonant groan filling the air. What was this thing? And how did it know me? The humming. It vibrated through the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87, a low, resonant thrum that felt less like sound and more like a pressure against my eardrums, against my very bones. I could feel the individual concrete blocks in the wall behind me, cool and rough, trembling subtly with the unseen energy. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just an old building. It was alive with something cold and hungry. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete, stale fear, and something else. A metallic tang like old blood or rust. My initial panic, that suffocating wave of grief and guilt, had begun to recede, replaced by a colder, sharper clarity. My family, the fire, my training, my profession. I was an architect. I built things. I understood structures, stresses, materials. This humming, this malevolent presence, whatever it was, had to have a physical source, a point of origin, a conduit. There had to be a logical explanation. There always was, or so I desperately needed to believe. I pushed myself off the wall, my knees stiff, the tremor in my hands a persistent nuisance. Each cell door, rusted and scarred, stood ajar, yawning like mouths in a silent scream. My eyes, trained to dissect blueprints and analyze structural integrity, began to scan the walls. The concrete blocks were standard, poured in place, but some sections looked different, patched, repaired, or perhaps built later. I moved slowly, methodically, tracing the lines of the mortar with my gaze. My breath plumed in front of me. I ran my hand over a section of wall near the far end where the humming seemed to intensify. The concrete here felt smoother, almost polished, despite the grime. It was a stark contrast to the rough, pitted surfaces around it. I tapped it with my knuckles. It sounded solid, but the resonance was peculiar, a deeper thud than the surrounding blocks. Dense. Too dense, like a material that shouldn't be there. I pulled out the small multi-tool I always carried, the one with the tiny screwdriver and a sharp pick. I knelt, scraping at the mortar line. It flaked away easily, crumbling into dust beneath my touch. This wasn't the original mix. It was softer, newer, hastily applied. My heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't a repair. It was an alteration. Carefully, I picked at the edges of the smooth section. The humming throbbed harder, a low growl now seeming to emanate directly from the wall. My fingers brushed against something metallic beneath the crumbling mortar. Not rebar, not structural reinforcement. A plate, a panel, what was hidden behind it. I worked with a furious, almost desperate intensity, my focus narrowed to this single point. It wasn't a crack, it was a joint. This section of the wall, perhaps 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall, was a separate panel, meticulously fitted into the original structure. My fingers found a tiny indentation, a small recess in the smooth surface. A handle, a latch. The panel shifted inward by a fraction of an inch, releasing a gust of stale, earthy air that carried with it an unsettling scent, not quite decay, but something ancient and stagnant like the breath of the earth itself. The humming soared, a high-pitched whine that clawed at my brain. What had I just opened? The humming. I could feel the individual concrete blocks in the wall behind me, cool and rough, trembling. It wasn't just my imagination. Not a phantom tremor from the memory of the house, but a real physical resonance. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy and cold, smelling of damp concrete and something metallic, like old blood or perhaps just rust. My breath hitched. My throat felt like sandpaper. I pressed my palms flat against the grimy wall, trying to anchor myself, but the vibration seemed to seep directly into my marrow. It started to build, a subtle crescendo that clawed at my nerves. The sound wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was everywhere, an omnipresent drone that resonated in the hollow space of the cell block, bouncing off the skeletal remains of bunk beds and shattered toilets. This wasn't just some old building settling. This was something alive. Something feeding. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A faulty generator, a distant train, but the intensity, the way it seemed to target me, defied logic. This hum, this vibration, it felt like an extension of that, a deeper, more primal manifestation. Then a flicker, a memory sharp and unwelcome of my family's laughter, the scent of burning wood, the acrid smoke filling my lungs. My chest tightened. The grief, a familiar, crushing weight, settled over me. And as it did, the humming intensified. It became a guttural growl, a deeper, more insistent thrum that seemed to burrow directly into my skull. My vision blurred at the edges. It wasn't a casual observation, it was a sickening realization. The hum wasn't just happening, it was reacting. It was reacting to me, to my thoughts, to my sorrow. I closed my eyes, trying to push the images away. My wife's smile, my daughter's bright eyes, the little boy who loved to build forts out of blankets. The guilt, a constant companion, tightened its grip. And the hum, like a predatory beast sensing weakness, roared in response. It was deafening now, vibrating through the soles of my shoes, up my legs, through my very teeth. I stumbled back from the wall, my hands flying to cover my ears, though it did little good. The sound was internal, a pressure behind my eyes. I could feel my own heart slamming against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming drone. This place, the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The ancestral home. They were connected, not just by the physical journey I'd made, but by something far more insidious. I remembered the old journals I'd found in the house, the faded ink detailing generations of misfortune, of inexplicable suicides, of families torn apart by unseen forces. The despair etched into those pages, the profound grief of those who had lived and died within the house's walls. Now they felt like warnings. The previous inhabitants, their suffering, my own profound grief, it was all a banquet. The entity in the house, the thing that had followed me here, it wasn't just a presence. It was a parasite. It fed. It grew stronger on the very thing that was tearing me apart. My guilt, my sorrow, my enduring pain over the fire. It was all fuel. The humming began to subside, slowly, reluctantly, as if sated. The pressure behind my eyes eased, leaving a dull ache. The air still hung heavy, stagnant. My family. Their faces flashed before me again, but this time the grief was tinged with a terrifying new understanding. I wasn't just haunted by their memory. I was a source of sustenance for something ancient and malevolent. The house hadn't just taken them. It had consumed their sorrow, and now it wanted mine. But what would happen when I had nothing left to give? And what had it done to all the others who had lived and grieved in that house before me? The humming. It wasn't just the air, not just the floor. It was inside the structure, inside the very fabric of the house, a deep guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. My teeth ached. My vision blurred at the edges, a subtle tremor that mimicked the building's own shudder. I pushed myself away from the wall, the rough concrete scraping against my jacket. The air in the cell block grew heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't quite place, something metallic like old blood mixed with the damp, earthy smell of decay and a faint, cloying sweetness. It was the smell of something wrong. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. This wasn't just a draft or the creaking of an old house settling. This was deliberate, this was here. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through the weariness that had settled deep in my bones. I had been foolish. I had been arrogant. I had thought I could understand this place, could perhaps even fix it, exorcise its ghosts with sheer will and architectural ingenuity. But this wasn't a problem to be solved with blueprints and structural integrity. This was a force, a hunger, and it was looking at me. My legs felt clumsy, leaden, as I stumbled back towards the narrow doorway that led out of the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The humming intensified, a high-pitched whine now layered beneath the thrum like a monstrous engine winding up. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical sensation, a painful pressure building behind my eyes. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to push back against the invisible force, but it was useless. No, I whispered, the word lost in the growing cacophony. No more. I had to get out. Not just out of this particular horrifying wing, but out of the house entirely. The thought was a sudden, desperate clarity. I had to leave. I had to abandon everything, my inheritance, my foolish hope for a fresh start. Whatever solace I had sought here was a lie, a trap baited with grief. I scrambled through the dark corridor, my footsteps echoing too loudly, too frantically. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled for the doorknob at the end of the hall, the one that led back to the main house. I twisted it, grunting with effort. It turned, but the door wouldn't budge. I pushed, then pulled, then threw my shoulder against the heavy oak. It was like trying to move a mountain. The wood felt solid, unyielding, as if it had fused with the frame. Panic began to bubble, hot and acrid, in the back of my throat. I could hear my own ragged breathing, loud in my ears, competing with the incessant hum that now seemed to resonate from the door itself. "Open," I rasped, my voice hoarse. "Open, damn you." I kicked at the bottom panel, a desperate, futile gesture. The wood shuddered, but the door remained sealed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The hum was a roar now, vibrating through my chest, making my teeth chatter. I spun around, abandoning the jammed door, and raced back through the main hall, past the grand staircase, towards the front entrance. The house groaned around me, a symphony of tortured wood and shifting foundations. The air was heavy, viscous, like wading through deep water. The massive front door, usually so grand and imposing, loomed before me. Its brass handle, once gleaming, was tarnished and dull, reflecting no light. I seized it, twisting with all my might. It wouldn't turn, it was locked, and I hadn't locked it. I never did. I yanked, I pulled, I slammed my shoulder into the thick oak, but it was like hitting bedrock. The locks, heavy and ancient, remained stubbornly engaged. I could hear the click, the metallic thunk of the deadbolts sliding home, one after another, even as I watched, even as my hands were nowhere near them. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't an old house being stubborn. This was something else. This was it. My gaze darted to the tall, narrow windows flanking the door. They were beautiful, stained glass panels depicting scenes of pastoral calm that now seemed grotesquely out of place. I raised my hand, intending to smash through one, to create an escape. But as my fingers brushed the cold glass, intricate patterns of frost bloomed across the inner surface, spreading like spiderwebs, obscuring the world outside. The glass thickened, became opaque, impenetrable. A low, guttural chuckle seemed to reverberate through the very walls, a sound that wasn't quite sound, but a feeling of malicious amusement. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out. My skin prickled with 1,000 invisible needles. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and it was holding me captive. Only the frantic thumping of my own heart broke the stillness. I was trapped, utterly, irrevocably trapped. What did it want from me? I kicked at the bottom panel, a desperate, futile gesture. I turned, looking back down the long, shadowed corridor towards the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The silence was heavy, almost physical, pressing in on me. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. My breath hitched. No, I couldn't go back there, not with whatever lurked in those deeper shadows, whatever had been drawn out by my presence. My hand scraped against the rough stone of the wall beside the locked door, searching for a seam, a weakness. Nothing. Panic, hot and sharp, began to claw at my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe, to think. There had to be another way. My fingers traced the mortar lines, feeling for any irregularity. A slight unevenness, a small recess just above my head. I reached higher, my fingertips brushing against something loose. Not a brick, but a small iron ring almost flush with the wall, hidden beneath decades of grime. My heart gave a jolt. I tugged. It resisted, then with a groan that echoed through the confined space, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. It was a smell like rust and old blood. My stomach clenched. I hesitated, peering into the blackness. The passage seemed to descend sharply, a gaping maw. This felt different. This felt intentional. My family had built this house, had lived here for generations. This wasn't just a part of the prison complex. This was theirs. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, its weak beam cutting a pathetic swat through the gloom. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders. The walls were rough-hewn stone, weeping moisture. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber. It was a library, I realized, or a study. A single heavy wooden desk dominated the center, cluttered with objects that seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Bookshelves lined the curved walls, not with leather-bound volumes but with brittle, yellowed ledgers, their spines unreadable in the dim light. My gaze fell upon the desk. There were drawings, architectural sketches, but unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not blueprints, but intricate, almost ritualistic diagrams of the house itself, overlaid with strange symbols, and a journal. My name, Raj, was etched into the cover in a florid, looping script that felt eerily familiar. My fingers trembled as I unclasped it. The pages crackled as I opened it, releasing a faint scent of dust and something acrid like burnt offerings. The handwriting inside was the same as on the cover. It was a chronicle spanning generations, detailing not events but exchanges, sacrifices. It spoke of a hunger, an entity that demanded sustenance. It spoke of a pact made long ago by my ancestors to ensure prosperity, power, influence, and the price. The price was grief. The price was guilt. My breath caught, it fed on it, my grief, my guilt. It had always been here, woven into the very foundations of the house, nurtured by the secrets and sins of my bloodline. The pages spoke of the chosen one, the one whose guilt would be the ultimate feast, the final sealing of the pact. My name again and again appeared in the margins, underlined, circled. My head swam. I wasn't just a victim then. I was the culmination, the architect of my own family's demise, and now the architect of my own sacrifice. My hands clenched, the journal crinkling under the pressure. The words blurred, but the implication was stark, horrifying. My family hadn't just suffered from this entity. They had cultivated it, fed it, used it. My own parents, my grandparents, they knew. They knew what was coming for me. I spun around, my phone beam dancing wildly across the curved walls. But the air in the chamber felt thick, heavy, like I was breathing through a shroud. The metallic tang was stronger now, mixed with something else, something cloying and sweet like blood and honey. My skin crawled. I looked back at the journal, at my name, etched into that ancient cover. My entire life, my entire tragedy had been a prelude, a carefully orchestrated performance for this thing. The house fire, the loss of my family, my crushing guilt, it was all part of the design. Their design, my vision blurred. Was there ever a way out of this legacy? The air there, even from a distance, felt like a gaping maw, exhaling a cold that was more than just temperature. It was a physical weight. I pressed my back against the locked door, my breath catching in my throat. A faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying orchids, began to seep into the stale air. My stomach churned. I knew that smell. It was the scent of its presence, the reek of its hunger. My hands trembled. My knees felt weak. I was trapped, a mouse in a maze designed by something utterly malevolent. But then a flicker. A memory of the fire, the smoke, the helpless screams, my family, my culpability. The entity fed on that. It wanted me to break, and in that moment something shifted inside me. I wouldn't be its meal. Not like this. My gaze snapped to a rusted vent high on the wall, barely visible above the gloom. It was small, too small, but desperation lent me a strange clarity. I dragged a fallen piece of masonry, a heavy, jagged chunk of brick, towards the wall. It scraped against the concrete, the sound echoing harshly. I stood on it, stretching, my fingertips just brushing the edge of the vent. With a grunt, I began to pry at it, digging my fingers into the corroded seams, ignoring the pain as rust flakes bit into my skin. The temperature plummeted. My breath plumed white. It was close. Finally, with a protesting groan, a corner of the vent gave way. I pulled, twisted, and the entire panel tore free, clattering to the floor. The opening was indeed tight, but perhaps, just perhaps, I squeezed, pushing my shoulders through, scraping my ribs raw against the rough concrete. The air in the shaft was choked with dust and the metallic tang of decay. I squirmed, pushing with my feet, my muscles screaming. My vision narrowed to the gray tunnel ahead. I didn't know where it led, but it had to be away from that. I tumbled out onto a heap of old crates in a forgotten storage room, the impact jarring my teeth. Dust billowed, catching in my throat. I coughed, tasting grit and stale air. My body ached, a symphony of bruises and scrapes, but I was out. I was free of that corridor, of the immediate threat. Running wasn't enough. Hiding wasn't enough. It was clear now. This thing wasn't just in the house, it was the house, or inextricably linked to it. And it was linked to my family. To me. I couldn't outrun my own legacy. I needed to understand. I needed to fight. My first thought was the library, a vast, seldom used room filled with generations of my family's accumulated knowledge. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten leather. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. I pulled down heavy tomes, their pages brittle, their bindings cracked. I ignored the architectural texts, the engineering manuals. I was looking for something else, something older, something hidden. My fingers, still raw from the vent, traced over faded titles, compendium of local folklore, the House of Blackwood, a genealogical study, notes on the ancient soil. I dismissed the more obvious historical accounts, searching for the strange, the esoteric. I needed to know what my ancestors had known, what they had faced. Had they merely lived with it, endured it? Or had they too tried to fight? Hours blurred into a dull ache in my neck and shoulders. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in deepening shades of gray. I could feel its eyes, its unseen presence, just beyond the edges of the light cast by my flickering lantern. Then, tucked away in a dusty alcove, behind a shelf of unremarkable poetry, I found it. A small, unassuming leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate knotwork symbol I didn't recognize. It was thin, almost delicate, and felt strangely warm in my hands. The pages within were filled with cramped, elegant script, the ink faded to sepia. The first entry was dated 1788. The shadow grows. The first legible line read, "It feeds on the sorrow of the stones, on the grievances whispered into the mortar." My breath hitched. Sorrow of the stones, grievances whispered into the mortar. This wasn't just an entity, it was ingrained, woven into the very fabric of the structure I had inherited. The journal spoke of a binding ritual, of sacred geometry, of materials that repel. It wasn't just a record of fear, it was a desperate attempt at containment. Crude, but unmistakably a floor plan of the ancestral home, my home, annotated with symbols and lines I recognized as structural elements, but also with others that were alien, archaic. They looked like wards, like traps. The last entry, dated 1801, was scrawled in a shaky hand. "The architect has failed. The binding weakens. It hungers again for the heart of the house, for the grief it knows so well. We must find the hidden chamber. We must reinforce the seals, else it will consume all." The hidden chamber, the seals. My own architectural training screamed at the impossibility, the sheer madness of it, yet the words resonated with a terrifying truth. My ancestors had tried to fight. They had built their defenses into the very walls, and somewhere there was a chamber, a place meant to contain this thing. But if it had been sealed for centuries, why was it active now, and where was it? The hidden chamber, the seals, and somewhere there was a chamber, a place meant. For what? A prison, a sanctuary, a weapon. The questions gnawed at me, a relentless itch under my skin. I had to find it. The old family journal, tucked away in a false bottom of a dusty desk drawer, offered a fragmented path. Its brittle pages, filled with faded ink and frantic scrawl, spoke of the great sorrow, the hungry silence, and the cage of the remorseful. An accompanying sketch, crude but unsettlingly familiar, showed a twisted knot of lines that mirrored the symbols I'd found etched into the cellar's stone. Beneath it, a single date, 87. A quick search of local historical archives, the online ones at least, yielded a single chilling result. A place notorious for its suffering, a stain on the town's memory. The cage of the remorseful. A place where guilt had festered, where despair had permeated the very mortar. If the entity fed on such things, then this cell block would be a veritable feast. And if my ancestors had fought it, perhaps they had left a clue there, a piece of the puzzle connecting their struggle to this town's forgotten anguish. My old pickup truck rattled over the cracked asphalt, the engine groaning in protest as I drove toward the edge of town. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. I knew this was a fool's errand, a desperate leap of faith based on the ramblings of long-dead kin. But what other choice did I have? The house was a trap, and I was its current occupant. The abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87, loomed ahead, a monolithic scar against the horizon. Its brick facade was crumbling, windows shattered like vacant eyes, gaping at the world. A chain-link fence, rusted and torn in places, offered no real barrier. The gate hung askew, groaning on a single hinge. This place felt wrong, not just neglected, but wrong. The ground was littered with broken glass and wind-whipped detritus. The scent of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, filled my nostrils. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating peeling paint, graffiti-scarred walls, and the skeletal remains of what might have been an old guard's desk. Footsteps. A soft scrape, then another. I wasn't alone. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. I could hear a faint, ragged breathing now, punctuated by a low, insistent murmur. It sounded like someone talking to themselves, a desperate, broken litany. I found him in what must have been the main cell block, a long corridor lined with empty cells, their barred doors hanging open or ripped from their hinges. He was hunched in a corner, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and tattered binders. The local historian, I realized, recognizing his face from articles in the town's small weekly paper. He didn't look at me, his gaze still locked on the empty space beside him. It knows you're looking, the blueprints of despair, this place. This is a well, a deep, deep well for it. He gestured vaguely at the cell block, his hand trembling. It doesn't just feed on individual guilt, Raj. It imprints itself onto places saturated with human suffering. This cell block, it's a locus, a reservoir. He fumbled through a binder, pulling out a faded photograph. The same twisted knot of lines from my ancestors' journal, markers, my research. It shows a pattern, places of intense accumulated misery, the riots here, the fires at my house generation after generation. It draws them in, the remorseful, it collects them, and the chamber I read looking for. It's not just a defense, it's a focal point. A place where the entity gathers its power, where it binds its offerings. He pushed the photograph into my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. They tried to fight it, my ancestors. They built defenses, yes, but they also built a trap or a cage for something. It's always here, and it doesn't like being discovered. A sudden sharp drop in temperature. The air grew impossibly heavy, suffocating. The acrid smell intensified, mingling with a faint, cloying sweetness. I felt a pressure against my chest, like an invisible hand pressing down. The historian let out a choked cry, his body seizing, his eyes rolling back. My flashlight beam danced wildly, revealing nothing but empty cells and the still form of the historian. He was breathing, but his eyes were vacant, his face slack. Whatever life, whatever fight he had left was gone. I was alone. The entity was here, and it had just shown me exactly what it could do. What was the chamber for? Was it a prison or a trap? And now that it knew I was looking, what would it do next? The historian's body convulsed on the grimy floorboards, a strangled gurgle tearing from his throat. His eyes, fixed on something I couldn't see, rolled back until only the whites were visible, stark and terrifying against his flushed face. The pressure on my chest intensified, a crushing weight that stole my breath, making my own lungs burn. The air, thick with that cloying sweetness and the metallic tang of something burning, felt like inhaling liquid rust. My vision blurred at the edges, the room swimming in a sickly green haze. I stumbled forward, reaching for the historian, but an invisible force slammed into me, throwing me back against the cold, damp wall. A sharp pain shot through my shoulder. He lay still then, twitching slightly, a thin line of spittle at the corner of his mouth. Unconscious, or worse. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, my heart racing. A frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence that had fallen over the house, broken only by the ragged rasp of my own breathing. It was here, right here. It tasted my fear, I knew it. It savored the historian's despair. There was no going back, no escape. The house had tightened its grip, a predatory maw closing around us. The only way out was through. My guilt, a living thing, clawed at my throat, my family. The fire, the designs, it all coalesced into a burning knot in my gut. This was it, the reckoning. I had to face it, not just for myself, but for the echoes of all those it had consumed, for the peace that had been denied to my own loved ones. I pushed off the wall, ignoring the ache in my shoulder, ignoring the trembling in my knees. Each step towards that tear in reality felt like wading through treacle. The acrid smell intensified, mixed now with something else, something fetid and ancient, like earth that had been dead for centuries. As I neared the opening, the faint, cloying sweetness became overwhelming, sickening, like rotting flowers doused in formaldehyde. I could almost taste it on my tongue, a bitter chemical sweetness. The crack wasn't just a crack. It was a doorway, a jagged, organic opening that pulsed with a faint, internal light, a sickly greenish yellow. It wasn't stone, not anymore. It was flesh or something akin to it, soft and yielding under my trembling fingers. I pushed through, the material parting with a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach lurch. I stepped into the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. Rows of rusted iron bars stretched into the gloom, forming cubicles that seemed to writhe in the dim, pulsing light. Every surface was coated in a fine, powdery dust, gray and suffocating, thick like ash. But this wasn't ash from a fire. This was something else, something that settled deep in my lungs with every shallow breath. The silence was profound, broken only by a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very soles of my shoes. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a pressure, a deep, internal thrumming that seemed to a man emanate from the very core of the cell block. My eyes strained to pierce the gloom, trying to make sense of the grotesque architecture. The cells themselves weren't empty. I moved deeper, my hand scraping against a rusted cell door. What had happened here? What had made this place so utterly desolate, so saturated with despair? The riot of '87. This place was a crucible, a feeding ground, a monument to anguish, not words but impressions, a child's whimper, a woman's sob, a man's guttural cry of despair. Their faces flickered at the edges of my vision, ephemeral and heartbreaking. My daughter's bright smile, my wife's knowing glance, my son's earnest gaze. They were here, woven into the fabric of this place, their memories twisted and used against me. Then I saw it. In the center of the largest cell, a structure unlike any I had ever designed. It was a model, but not of a building. It was a grotesque, organic sculpture, built from what looked like dried sinews and blackened bone. It pulsed with the same sickly green light as the doorway, and from its core, tendrils of the cloying sweetness emanated, weaving through the cell block like invisible threads. Around its base, scattered like offerings, were small, desiccated figures. Not human, not quite. They were contorted, twisted, their forms barely recognizable, but I knew with a sickening certainty what they represented. My breath hitched. My vision swam. Among them, I recognized a tiny, perfectly rendered doll of my daughter, her small head tilted in silent agony. Beside it, a figure of my wife, her arms outstretched in a final, desperate plea. And my son, a miniature, charred husk. The entity had taken them, absorbed them, fed on their anguish, and then, my guilt erupted, a volcano of self-loathing burning through me, searing my very soul. This was the ultimate manifestation. My family reduced to playthings, monuments to my failure, my architectural hubris. The low hum intensified, vibrating through my teeth, my bones. The air grew impossibly thick, like breathing through wet cloth. The entity was here at the core of this twisted creation, feeding on the raw, unadulterated anguish it had collected. It was a monument to grief, a temple of despair, and I, the architect of my own family's demise, had walked right into its heart. What did it want from me now? The crushing weight intensified, squeezing the air from my lungs until my vision blurred at the edges. The historian's final gurgle echoed in my ears, a wet, rattling sound that would forever haunt my memory. His eyes, frozen in a rictus of terror, stared past me, past the ceiling, into a void only he could perceive. Then the world buckled. It wasn't a physical shift, not a tremor or a lurch. It was a complete unraveling of reality, a sickening lurch of perception that dragged me through a tunnel of pure, suffocating darkness. I felt myself stretching, twisting like a rubber band pulled taut, then snapping. Then a sudden, brutal impact. My knees hit something hard and unforgiving. The air, sharp and metallic, scraped against my raw throat. I coughed, a dry, ragged sound, and pushed myself up, my hands scraping against rough concrete. I was no longer in the ancestral home. The air here was thick with the scent of rust, damp concrete, and something else, a faint, lingering stench of despair, like old tears dried on stone. My gaze swept across the grim landscape. Rusted bars stretched upwards, disappearing into the gloom. Peeling paint, a sickly institutional green, flaked from crumbling walls. Empty cells like skeletal mouths lined either side of a narrow walkway. Plink, plink that echoed endlessly. This was the abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. It wasn't just in the air, it was woven into the very fabric of this place, an unseen architect of despair. It had brought me to its lair, its feeding ground. You recognize this place, don't you, Raj? The thought wasn't mine. It was a whisper in the back of my mind, laced with a familiar, cloying sweetness that curdled into malevolence. A place of containment, a place of shattered hopes, just like your own heart. A flicker of heat, then the searing image of my family's house, engulfed in flames, flashed behind my eyes. The roar of the fire, the acrid smoke, the desperate cries, they were all there, as vivid as the day it happened. The entity was projecting my worst memories, trying to break me. It wanted me to succumb, to become another echo in this desolate place, but I wouldn't, not anymore. I had faced the truth of my own culpability, grieved the past, and found a sliver of resolve. My family was gone, yes, and I would carry that burden forever, but it wouldn't be the entity's sustenance. It would be my foundation. I forced myself to breathe, to push past the suffocating grief. My eyes, trained by years of architectural study, began to scan the cell block. I saw beyond the rust and decay. I saw the structure. The load-bearing walls, the vaulting arches, the reinforced concrete, the steel bars, all designed for one purpose, to contain. It broke open. Chaos reigned. Life spilled out like water from a shattered vessel. And you shattered your own vessel, didn't you? Another flash, the blueprint of my family home, pristine and perfect, then overlaid with cracks, fissures, fire. My design, my failure. The entity wanted me to believe I was nothing more than a failed architect, a creator of destruction. But it was wrong. I was an architect. I understood how structures worked, how they failed, and how they could be reinforced. This place, this abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87, was a testament to a breach, a failure of containment. The entity wasn't just here. It was the echo of that breach, the despair of that failure, the raw energy of chaos unleashed. It fed on the lack of containment, and that was its weakness. My eyes narrowed, tracing the lines of the cells, the thick, unyielding concrete. This wasn't just a place of suffering, it was a gigantic, flawed cage. The entity had brought me here to break me, to absorb my despair. But it had made a mistake. It had brought me to its own prison. I focused, my mind racing through schematics, stress points, the principles of structural integrity. An architect doesn't just build. An architect contains. They define spaces, create boundaries, direct flow. The riot of '87 had been a moment when those boundaries collapsed. The entity was a manifestation of that collapse. I looked at the rusted bars, the broken locks, the gaping holes where once solid doors had been. The cell block was a sieve. But what if I could rebuild the containment, not with physical materials, but with will, with focus, with the very energy the entity sought to consume? What if I could design a prison for it? It sensed my shift, my determination. It understood the threat of a mind focused on structure, on order, on containment. "You cannot build walls against me, little man." It shrieked, the sound tearing at the air, causing the very concrete to vibrate beneath my feet. A wave of suffocating grief slammed into me, 1,000 voices of despair crying out, trying to overwhelm my resolve. Images of my wife, my children, their faces contorted in silent screams, flickered before me, trying to break my concentration. I shut my eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them, my gaze unwavering. I saw the cell block not as a ruin, but as a blueprint. The thick walls, the ceiling, the floor, they were all points of connection. The missing doors, the broken bars, they were breaches. I would seal them. I raised my hands, not in supplication, but as if to mold the very air. I imagined the steel rebar within the concrete, strengthening, interlocking. I visualized the broken locks reforming, the rusted hinges grinding back into place. I saw every cracked surface mending, every gap closing. I was rebuilding this prison, brick by invisible brick, bar by ethereal bar. I was using my grief, my guilt, my love for my family, not as weakness, but as the mortar, the binding agent. This sorrow, this pain, would be the very material of its cage. The entity shrieked again, a sound of pure agony, not triumph. It was fighting, trying to dismantle my mental construction, to shatter my focus, but I held firm. My mind, sharp and precise, worked with the speed of a seasoned architect, calculating loads, reinforcing stress points, envisioning an unbreakable seal. I was not just Raj, the grieving widower. I was Raj, the architect, and I was building. The cell block groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from its very foundations. Was it the building reacting to my will or the entity's struggle? I felt a tremendous pull, as if the entire structure was trying to collapse in on itself or perhaps on me. But I pushed back, channeling every ounce of my being into the mental construct. The entity was thrashing, its presence shrinking, condensing, as if being forcibly compressed. It was trying to escape, to tear free of the containment I was imposing. Had I truly found its weakness? Could an architect's will, fueled by a grief transformed into resolve, truly bind a malevolent force that fed on despair? The last shriek of the entity had torn through the air, a sound like grinding stone and forgotten grief before it recoiled. I didn't know if it was banished or merely wounded, but the crushing weight on my chest had lifted. My breath hitched, a ragged, painful thing. I fell to my knees, the splintered floorboards digging into my skin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the ravaged roof, a silent, morbid celebration of the chaos. My entire body thrummed with a dull ache, a deep vibration that felt less like muscle fatigue and more like the aftershock of a tectonic shift. I pushed myself up, using a charred support beam as a crutch. The house was a skeleton. Walls had buckled inward, revealing the lath and plaster beneath, like exposed bone. A section of the ceiling, directly above where the entity had manifested most fiercely, had collapsed, leaving a gaping wound to the night sky. Ash and fine debris coated everything, a gray shroud over the vibrant patterns of the old wallpaper, dulling the colors to a uniform despair. The air, once thick with the entity's oppressive presence, now tasted of burnt timber, damp earth, and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach clench. I was alive. I had survived. The thought was a fragile thing, barely taking root in the exhausted landscape of my mind. My hands trembled, not from fear now, but from the sheer depletion of every reserve I possessed. My clothes were torn, my skin scraped and bruised, but the internal damage felt far deeper. I had faced the manifestation of my deepest fears, my guilt, my failure, and I had not broken. I had pushed back. I had remembered I was an architect. I understood structure. I had found a flaw in its design, a vulnerability in its terrifying edifice of despair. Or at least I had found a way to make it retreat for now. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating blanket after the cacophony. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, but the hushed stillness of a tomb. I moved through the wreckage, my bare feet crunching on plaster shards and broken glass. I had to assess the damage, a reflex born from my profession, even as my mind screamed for rest. The grand staircase, once a symbol of opulence, now listed precariously, its banister snapped in two like a broken limb. The ornate carvings were obscured by soot. It was coming from below, from somewhere deeper within the house's foundation. My architect's eye, despite my exhaustion, snagged on an anomaly. Beneath the staircase, where the main support column met the stone foundation, there was a jagged tear in the aged mortar. It wasn't just structural damage from the entity's rampage. It looked like an opening violently forced. Curiosity, a dangerous, persistent thing, pulled me towards it. I knelt, my knees protesting with a sharp ache. A stench different from the ash and damp wafted out a stagnant, metallic smell like old blood and rust, mingled with something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. My stomach rebelled. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to find a way out of this ruined house, to flee the remnants of the horror. But the architect in me, the part that craved understanding, that sought the truth of a building's bones, urged me forward. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a living, breathing testament to something ancient and malevolent. And this opening, this was a new artery. I took a deep, shuddering breath and squeezed through the jagged hole. The stone scraped against my back, my shoulders. I crawled forward, hands blindly searching for purchase on rough, uneven stone. My breath plumed in the frigid air. Metal. I pushed forward, pulling myself out of the crawl space, and stood upright, my head brushing against a low ceiling. My eyes, accustomed to the gloom, began to discern vague shapes. I was in a corridor. Each door had a small, barred slit at eye level. A profound sense of despair, a crushing weight of countless forgotten lives, settled over me. This wasn't a cellar. This wasn't a hidden room. This was beneath my ancestral home. This was part of its foundation. My family's legacy wasn't just a house, it was a prison. What terrible secrets had been walled up down here connected to the very structure I now inhabited? What kind of architect had designed this? My breath tore at my throat, each gasp a jagged shard in my lungs. I was on my knees, the floorboards cold and rough against my palms. The splint, a crude bandage of wood and cloth, had torn loose from my arm, dangling uselessly. My shoulder throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat beneath the fading echo of the entity's shriek. That sound, grinding stone and forgotten grief, still vibrated in the air, a phantom chord of agony that left my ears ringing. Had it gone, or merely retreated, a wounded beast licking its wounds in the dark corners of the house? It felt like the air had been sucked from the room, leaving behind a vacuum. My eyes darted around the ruined study, the overturned furniture, the scorch marks on the walls. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the broken windows, illuminated by a faint, sickly green glow that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady, my body a chorus of aches and tremors. What was left to fight? The silence was heavier than any sound, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on me. Nothing, only the frantic thumping of my own heart, a desperate drum against my ribs. I stumbled through the wreckage, my hand trailing along the wall seeking purchase. My fingers brushed against a section of the wainscoting that felt loose, out of place. It was a faint tremor, an almost imperceptible shift beneath my touch. My mind, still reeling from the confrontation, seized on it. A hidden mechanism, another secret in this house of secrets. I pressed harder, my injured arm screaming in protest. A soft click echoed in the stillness, startling me. A narrow section of the wall, disguised perfectly by the ornate wood carvings, swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges. What could possibly be down there? The stairs were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the gloom. My breath plumed before me. The stairwell twisted, descending deeper and deeper until I emerged into a vast, cavernous space. It was undeniably an abandoned cell block, closed since the riot of '87. The iron bars of the cells were rusted solid, some twisted and broken as if by immense force. The concrete floor was cracked, littered with debris and the skeletal remains of what looked like cots. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was a forgotten prison, built into the very foundations of my ancestral home. The riot of '87, that was the year my grandfather had abruptly sealed off the lower levels of the house, claiming a structural collapse. A lie, of course. My beam swept across the walls, revealing faded, desperate scratchings, tally marks, and names I didn't recognize, alongside crude, unsettling symbols. My family hadn't just lived with the entity, they had contained it. Or worse, they had fed asterisk it. In the center of the largest cell, where the iron bars were most severely warped, stood a crude stone altar. On its surface, amidst dried, blackened stains, lay a collection of journals. Their covers were brittle, their pages yellowed and fragile. I picked up the topmost one, my fingers trembling. The handwriting was my great-grandfather's, unmistakable. He detailed not just the entity's history, but my family's complicity. They had lured people here, those deemed unwanted or troublesome, trapping them in this cell block. The entity, drawn by their despair, had grown stronger, feeding on their grief and their final, desperate moments. My own guilt, the fire that took my family, was just the latest offering. The architects of my past trauma were not just the entity, but the blood that ran in my veins. The entity wasn't a random curse. It was a hungry ghost born of my family's depravity. It wasn't about banishing it, it was about ending the source. I looked at the journals, then at the desolate cells, then back up the winding stairs to the house above. This place couldn't simply be abandoned. It had to be purged. Not with fire, not with destruction, but with something far more permanent. I knew what I had to do. I had to break the cycle, once and for all, but how? And what would be left of me when it was done?